Welcome to Vale Marks, where stories find their way into your heart. This is not just a story about a baby or a dog. It's about what happens when pain meets loyalty, when love speaks without words, and when healing comes in the quietest form. What you're about to hear will move you deeply, because some stories don't need miracles, just devotion. Sometimes, the smallest things take up the most room in your heart. Winnie the Pooh. Watch until the very end. This is one of the most meaningful and emotional stories we've ever shared. And if it touches your soul, let us know in the comments and consider subscribing. 1,000 hearts is all it takes to keep us creating. The glass was cold. Emily pressed her forehead gently against it, as if closing the distance between herself and the tiny figure inside the incubator. Beyond the thick pane of NICU glass, a baby no larger than her hand lay motionless beneath a tangle of tubes and wires. His chest barely rose beneath the translucent film of his paper-thin skin, and his face, still unformed in so many ways, was a shade too red, too fragile. It looked almost unreal, like something borrowed from a dream or a nightmare. A soft beeping echoed in the background, steady and robotic, like a heartbeat made of electricity. Beep, beep, beep. It never stopped, and in this small, fluorescent room, it was the only sound that reminded them their son was still alive. Josh stood beside her, shoulders tense and arms folded tight across his chest, as if trying to keep something inside from falling apart. He didn't speak. Neither did Emily. Not anymore. There was nothing left to say. They had whispered every prayer, spoken every hope, and cried every tear in the early days. Now, silence became their language, and worry lived in the space between their shallow breaths. Their son, Leo, though no one had said his name out loud in days, was born 12 weeks early. One moment Emily was laughing about the baby kicking her ribs too hard, and the next she was in an ambulance, blinking through tears and the blare of sirens. Her water broke too soon. Her body betrayed them. And the baby came before he was ready. No one told them how painful it would be to become parents like this. No one said that the first time they'd see their child, he would be wrapped in wires instead of blankets, touched by strangers in gloves, instead of held close to a beating heart. No one said their arms would ache in ways deeper than muscle or bone. Leo had not yet cried, not once. He hadn't made a sound since the moment he was born. They called it a miracle he survived the delivery. They called it a blessing he made it through the first night. But every day after that was something else entirely. Waiting. Hoping. Watching. Fearing. Emily hadn't held him, not even for a second. She wasn't allowed to. He was too fragile, the nurses said, too vulnerable. Just a little longer, they always promised. But days were beginning to blur together. Time moved like it was underwater, thick, distorted, suffocating. She sat in the same chair outside the NICU, hour after hour, staring through the glass, memorizing the tiny shape of him, as if her eyes could somehow do what her hands could not. Every beep from the machines inside felt like a signal from another world, one where she was not allowed. Josh kept pacing. Every few minutes he'd walk down the hall to the vending machine, not to buy anything, just to move, to breathe. When he returned, he would stand again beside her, wordless. His face, usually so composed, was tired in ways she had never seen before. Beneath his unshaven stubble, his jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack. The hallway outside the NICU had become their world, a space lit with cold, buzzing lights and filled with people who spoke in hushed voices and avoided eye contact. Every parent here was living a similar agony. But no one ever spoke about tomorrow. That was the rule. Tomorrow was uncertain, dangerous even. Hope was a luxury, and grief sat silently in the corners of the room, waiting. Sometimes Emily imagined herself waking up from this. She would open her eyes and find her belly round again, full of kicking and laughter and promise. She would go back to painting the nursery walls and reading baby name books aloud, while Josh teased her for changing her mind every 5 minutes. But she never woke up, and Leo was still behind the glass. One night, while Josh had gone outside for air, a nurse walked over and sat beside Emily. She was young, probably mid-20s, but her eyes carried weight. She didn't say much, just offered a cup of lukewarm tea and placed her hand softly on Emily's shoulder. "He hears you," she said gently. "Even if he doesn't move, he hears you." That night, Emily began whispering. Every word barely audible, like a secret she was too scared to speak aloud. She told Leo about the first time she saw his heartbeat on the ultrasound, about how Josh cried when they found out it was a boy, about how she used to sing to him when he was still inside her belly. She whispered every dream she had tucked away, every plan they'd made, and she apologized. Over and over again, for not being able to hold him, for not being able to do more, for not being stronger, and then she cried, quietly, desperately, until her shoulders shook and the glass blurred from tears. Inside the NICU, Leo didn't move. But the machines kept beeping. Beep, beep, beep. Behind her, Josh returned. He didn't ask what she was whispering. He just sat down, took her hand, and stared at their son. They sat that way for hours, wrapped in silence, in grief, in hope too heavy to name. No one tells you what it's like to love someone so fiercely you'd give your life for them, and yet never have the chance to hold their hand. No one prepares you for the loneliness of that kind of love. And in that lonely space where neither hope nor despair could claim them fully, a story began, not with grand gestures or miracles, but with a whisper pressed against glass and a baby too small for the world, still fighting to stay. Emily wasn't sleeping. Nights had become stretches of silence, filled with ceiling shadows and the soft ticking of the clock beside her hospital-issued water jug. It wasn't the kind of sleeplessness born of caffeine or discomfort. It was the kind that grows when your baby is fighting to breathe 3 floors below you, and all you can do is wait. It was on the 4th morning, while Emily sat in the hospital's family lounge, sipping cold coffee from a paper cup, that a young nurse named Hannah approached her with a gentle voice and tired smile. "You know," she said, sitting beside her, "some parents find it helpful to foster a pet during all this." Emily blinked, unsure if she heard correctly. "An animal?" she asked, voice dry from crying. "Yeah, not something huge, just something alive that needs you." "It helps." Emily gave a half smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The idea felt absurd. She could barely hold herself together, let alone care for something else. But Hannah just patted her shoulder and added, "Sometimes healing comes from unexpected places." Later that evening, Emily mentioned it to Josh, expecting him to wave it off. To her surprise, he nodded slowly. "Might not be the worst idea," he said. "Might make home feel less empty." The next morning, wrapped in coats they hadn't worn since before the baby came early, they drove in silence to a local animal rescue center. Neither of them had ever owned a dog. Emily, in fact, had always been afraid of them, especially large breeds. But the silence in their house had become unbearable. It echoed with unspoken fears, unfinished lullabies, and baby clothes still waiting on hangers. The rescue center smelled like wet fur and antiseptic. Rows of kennels lined both walls, each with its own cacophony. Some dogs barked wildly, others pawed at the gates, desperate for attention. The noise was overwhelming, chaotic, a swirl of longing and confusion, and then, in the far corner, they saw him. He wasn't barking, he wasn't pacing, he wasn't even standing. Just sitting quietly, front legs straight, head slightly bowed, eyes locked on something far beyond the chain-link fence in front of him. A stocky, muscular pit bull, with a dusting of grey along his muzzle and scars barely hidden beneath his tan coat. He looked still, like a statue that had given up waiting to be noticed. Emily paused in front of his kennel, hands in her coat pockets. Something about him was different. He wasn't withdrawn exactly, but it felt like he carried a story. Not in the way dogs usually do, with tails and barks and excited leaps, but with something quieter, something in his eyes. A shelter volunteer noticed them and walked over. "That's Diesel," she said. "Been here almost 5 months now." "No one's really asked about him." Emily kept staring. "What's his story?" The volunteer hesitated, then knelt beside the kennel. He belonged to an older couple, nice folks. Their daughter passed away unexpectedly, and they were raising their grandson. The little boy was born premature. He spent months in the NICU. Passed away before his first birthday. Josh's brow furrowed. They say Diesel used to lie under the baby's crib every night. After the boy died, the couple couldn't keep him anymore. Said it hurt too much to see him sitting in the same spot every night, staring at the crib. Emily's throat tightened. "So he just waits now?" she asked. The volunteer nodded. "Pretty much. Every day he sits like that, staring toward the front gate. Doesn't really bark. Doesn't really eat unless we hand feed him. We think he's waiting for someone, or maybe just trying to understand what happened." Emily crouched down, closer to the kennel, and for a moment, just a moment, the dog looked directly at her. Not at her face, but into her, like he saw something he recognized. Sorrow. Exhaustion. That hollow feeling people carry when grief has moved in and made itself comfortable. He didn't move. Didn't wag. Didn't flinch. But Emily felt something shift. She stood up abruptly, turned to Josh and said, "I want to meet him." Josh blinked. "The pit bull?" She nodded. The volunteer smiled. "He's gentle. A little slow to trust, but he's never shown aggression. Just sadness." They brought Diesel into a quiet room, leash loose, movements calm. He didn't sniff around or jump. He walked to the far corner, sat, and glanced at the door, as if checking to see if someone else was coming. Someone he was still waiting for. Emily knelt on the floor and whispered, "Hey, buddy." Diesel looked at her again. No tail wag, no bark, just steady, ancient eyes. She reached out slowly, fingers trembling. He didn't pull away, just blinked, slow and soft. When her hand touched his head, she expected fear. But what she felt was warmth, a quiet kind of peace, the kind you find only in things that have broken and kept going anyway. Emily didn't cry then. Not yet. But something in her chest cracked open. On the drive home, Diesel lay quietly in the back seat, curled into himself. He didn't seem curious, didn't sniff the air like other dogs, just watched out the window like someone returning to a town where too many memories lived. Josh glanced in the rearview mirror and said, "He's quiet." Emily nodded. "He's been through a lot." Later, as they opened the front door and guided Diesel inside, he didn't run or explore. He walked straight into the living room, curled up next to the unused baby rocker, and rested his head on his paws. Emily stood frozen in the hallway, hand over her mouth. Josh whispered, "He found his place." And neither of them knew yet, but they had just brought home the one soul who would save them all. From the very first morning they brought Diesel home, he made one thing clear: he was not going to be left behind. When Emily and Josh grabbed their coats and keys to visit the hospital, Diesel quietly positioned himself by the front door, his leash in his mouth. The first time, they thought it was a coincidence. The second time, they tried to distract him with a treat. By the third morning, they stopped trying. It was as if he understood exactly where they were going and who was waiting on the other side of that glass. At the hospital, Diesel didn't bark. He didn't whine or pace. He simply followed them to the hallway just outside the NICU, settled into his usual spot beneath the large viewing window, and lay down with his head resting between his paws. His eyes never left the incubator. At first, the nurses were caught off guard. A pit bull in the hospital? That wasn't something you saw every day. But Diesel had a way about him. Quiet, still, respectful. He wasn't just calm. He was present. He didn't demand attention or create disruption. He simply watched, as though standing silent vigil over the small, fragile baby inside. After a few days, the staff started to smile when they saw him. They began calling him the Sentinel. One of the doctors even joked, "Looks like the little guy's got himself a big brother." And the name stuck. From then on, Diesel wasn't just the family's dog. He was Leo's silent guardian. Emily found herself spending more and more time on the hallway floor beside Diesel. She sat with her back against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, her gaze locked on the same small form within the incubator. The glass separated them, but somehow, having Diesel beside her made that space feel smaller. Less cold, she talked to him, not because she believed he could understand, but because she needed someone to hear her without interrupting. Without trying to fix anything, without telling her to stay strong or have faith, Diesel just listened. "I used to dream about what he'd look like," she whispered one afternoon, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the floor. "I pictured him with Josh's nose, big brown eyes like mine. I even bought this tiny blue hat. I kept it in my purse for months." Diesel didn't move. Just flicked one ear slightly in her direction. "I was so careful, you know. Took the vitamins. Ate the greens. I even stopped coffee, and then one car. 1 second. That's all it took." Her voice cracked, and she pressed her sleeve to her face. Diesel shifted, resting his chin gently on her shoe. She continued, sometimes barely louder than a breath. She told him about their wedding day, how nervous Josh had been, how the cake had nearly tipped over during the toast. She told him about the night they found out they were pregnant, and how Josh had danced around the kitchen like a kid on Christmas morning. And she told him about the accident, the sudden jolt, the flashing lights, the sirens, and the quiet afterward, the terrifying, echoing quiet. And still, Diesel listened. Meanwhile, Josh found it harder to sit still. He didn't talk as much, didn't cry in front of anyone. Instead, he paced. He fetched coffee. Neither of them drank. He scrolled through his phone without seeing the screen. He studied the hospital floor tiles like they held some kind of answer. He kept moving, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant facing the truth, that they might lose Leo before they ever got to know him. One day, Josh disappeared for longer than usual. Emily thought maybe he'd stepped outside for air, but when he didn't come back for nearly 40 minutes, she got worried. She found him in the men's room, locked in a stall, his shoulders shaking. He didn't hear her come in, didn't see Diesel curl up outside the stall door, head tilted just slightly toward the sound of muffled sobs. Josh had always been the steady one, the builder, the fixer, the rock. But now, alone in a public bathroom, he wept like a boy, for the things he couldn't repair, for the helplessness that gnawed at his chest, for the fact that he couldn't protect the two people he loved most. When he finally stepped out, his eyes red and swollen, Diesel was waiting. The dog didn't jump or whine or lick his face. He just stood, quiet and patient, as if to say, "It's okay, I'm here." They didn't talk about it. Josh never mentioned the crying. Emily never asked. But from that day on, Josh began to sit longer by the window. Sometimes he'd rest his hand on Diesel's back, grounding himself in that warm, steady presence. Over time, Diesel became more than just a pet or a companion. He became part of the ritual. Every morning, he took his place outside the NICU. Every afternoon, he lay quietly through the doctor's rounds. In the evenings, when Emily whispered her fears into the still air, Diesel offered the only comfort he knew, his silent, unwavering presence. The three of them, Emily, Josh, and Diesel, sat day after day in that long, echoing corridor. They didn't always speak. Most days, they didn't need to. Because somehow, in the silence, in the shared grief, in the long hours of waiting, something deeper began to form. Not hope, not yet, but something like it. Something that lived in the stillness between the beeps of the machines, in the warmth of fur against a shoe, in the heavy exhale of a man who had run out of tears. Three hearts, each carrying their own pain, sat together on that cold hospital floor, bound by love, loss, and a baby boy behind the glass. The hospital was quieter at night. Most of the lights in the hallway had been dimmed, casting soft golden glows across the floor. The buzz of monitors, the occasional creak of wheels, and the steady mechanical beeping from inside the NICU were the only sounds that filled the stillness. Emily sat slouched in her usual spot outside the glass, her back resting against the wall, her eyes glassy from too little sleep and too many prayers. Josh was slumped in the chair next to her, arms crossed, chin on his chest. Diesel lay beneath his feet, his breathing deep and steady, his body curved protectively around Josh's shoes, like a sentinel standing guard even in sleep. It was 2 in the morning when the silence snapped. First came the sound, a single sharp tone, longer than usual. Then another. Then a shrill alarm that split the quiet into panic. Emily's head shot up. For a second, she didn't move. She didn't have to. Her body knew what that sound meant before her brain could process it. Leo had stopped breathing. Inside the NICU, red lights flared above the incubator. The door burst open and 2 nurses rushed in, followed by a doctor. The sound of rapid instructions filled the air, muted only slightly by the glass wall that now felt more like a prison. Emily scrambled to her feet, hands pressed against the glass. "No," she whispered. "No, please, not now." Not him. The world tilted. Josh stood frozen, his eyes locked on the motionless figure inside the incubator. His limbs refused to move. His breath caught in his chest. Everything else, sound, time, reason, faded into static. And then Diesel barked. It wasn't loud, not at first. A single, low sound that rumbled like thunder on a distant plain. But then it came again, sharper, louder, urgent. A full-bodied bark that echoed down the sterile hallway like a flare cutting through fog. It startled everyone. The nurses turned. One of them, familiar with Diesel by now, looked toward the door in disbelief. Josh blinked. Emily gasped. The bark wasn't angry. It wasn't afraid. It was something else. Insistent. Alive. And somehow, impossibly, a second later, the numbers on Leo's monitor jumped. A blip. Then another. Then the beeping started again, irregular at first, then more steady. The doctor barked a new order. One nurse gave a thumbs up. The red light above the incubator dimmed. Leo's heart was beating again. Emily collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Josh let out a noise that wasn't quite a cry, not quite a laugh. Diesel, standing now, stared through the glass as if he'd known what was happening before anyone else. His ears were up, his tail still alert, present. Later, when Leo was stabilized and the NICU lights returned to their gentle glow, the lead physician approached the couple in the hallway. "You said this dog's been here every day?" he asked, eyes flicking to Diesel, who now sat with the patience of an old monk. Emily nodded, wiping her face. "He doesn't like being left at home." The doctor hesitated, then added, "We've been exploring animal-assisted therapy and early neonatal development. It's rare in critical cases like this, but after what we just saw, I'd like to try something." "You mean bring him in?" Josh asked, brows raised. The doctor nodded. "Just for a few minutes, carefully. Let the baby sense him. Smell him. Maybe even touch. With your permission, of course." Emily didn't even need to think. She looked at Josh. He gave a slow, silent nod. That afternoon, under strict guidance and layers of sterile precautions, Diesel was allowed into the NICU. One nurse guided Emily, while another escorted Diesel. He moved carefully, his head low, as if sensing the delicacy of the moment. There were wires, tubes, beeping, but Diesel didn't flinch. Emily approached the incubator. Her hands trembled as she reached in through the access ports to gently lift Leo's hand, no bigger than her thumb. Diesel stood beside her, close but still. When she lowered Leo's tiny fingers to rest against the soft fur on Diesel's head, something incredible happened. Leo's pinky twitched, a small, jerky movement, almost imperceptible, but it was there. His hand had moved. Diesel tilted his head, then lowered it slowly until his nose brushed Leo's fingers, and then, with the gentlest motion, he licked. A single, soft swipe of his tongue against Leo's paper-thin skin. Every person in the room stopped breathing. Emily gasped. A nurse whispered, "Oh my God." One of the monitors gave a tiny spike, and in that moment, something in the room changed. The sterile walls felt warmer. The coldness of the machines less harsh. It was as if the entire NICU had exhaled. Josh, who had been watching from outside the glass, turned away. Not to hide, but because he couldn't hold back the flood behind his eyes. His chest ached, not with fear this time, but with gratitude so intense it felt foreign. He pressed a fist to his mouth, tears slipping past his fingers. A single tear slid down his cheek as he looked at Diesel. This wasn't just a dog. This was something else. A presence, a protector, a being who, in the moment they needed it most, had reminded them what it meant to be alive. From that day forward, Leo's recovery took on a new rhythm. And Diesel's place in their story, no longer just a visitor at the glass, but a part of the heartbeat behind it, was forever sealed. The shift in the NICU was subtle at first. It wasn't the machines or the numbers that changed, it was the mood. The air, once thick with tension and sterilized silence, began to carry something lighter, like hope, but gentler. Like laughter learning how to return, Leo was healing. No one could explain it entirely. The doctors said his vitals were improving steadily. His heart rate was stabilizing. His oxygen levels were up. His breathing was stronger each day, but behind the numbers and charts, the staff whispered about Diesel. Because every morning, like clockwork, Diesel arrived. He didn't need to be called. No leash was required. He simply trotted down the hospital corridor beside Emily or Josh and took his spot near the NICU door, his posture relaxed, eyes focused. The nurses greeted him like an old friend. "Morning, Dr. Diesel," one of them would say with a grin. And Diesel, tail wagging once or twice, would settle himself just outside the incubator, careful not to disturb any wires or monitors. He always lay on the right side, somehow sensing that the left side was crowded with machines. It was as if he understood the choreography of the room, and quietly adapted himself to it. The first time Emily saw Leo's monitors spike in excitement as Diesel approached, she thought it was a coincidence. But when it happened again and again, the pattern became undeniable. Every time Diesel entered the NICU, Leo's tiny body reacted. His breathing deepened, his pulse quickened, his fingers curled just a little more. "It's like he knows his friend is here," one nurse whispered. Diesel, of course, never made a sound. He simply watched. He seemed to know when to lean his head close to the incubator and when to stay still, offering only his presence. And somehow, that presence was enough. Emily started smiling again. Not the small, tired smiles of someone pretending to be okay, but real ones, ones that reached her eyes. She'd sit beside Leo's bed, rubbing Diesel's ears, telling him stories from when she was pregnant. She told him how Leo used to kick every time Josh played guitar, how he'd start bouncing at the sound of Emily's laugh. Josh noticed the change too. One morning, after watching Diesel curl up with his chin resting on Emily's sneaker, Josh knelt beside them and said, "He's part of our family now, isn't he?" Emily just nodded, tears brimming but not falling. Josh, once so guarded with his emotions, began opening up. He started reading books aloud to Leo, sometimes slipping in corny jokes or silly voices that made Emily giggle. One afternoon, he leaned close to the incubator and whispered, "If you get better, I promise I'll let Diesel pick what movie we watch first." Diesel, as if on cue, gave a loud snore from the corner. Everyone burst out laughing. That became a regular thing. Diesel snoring mid-visit. It started soft, then louder, sometimes accompanied by a twitch of his paws like he was chasing something in his dreams. The nurses began placing gentle bets on how long he'd stay awake each day. The current record was 42 minutes. One afternoon, a doctor came in to check Leo's vitals, only to find Diesel fast asleep in his chair. The large pit bull was sprawled comfortably, one paw dangling over the armrest. The doctor looked at the nurses, deadpan. "I guess he's running this department now." "No use arguing," someone said. "He doesn't give up that seat." It became a running joke. Diesel as the unofficial NICU supervisor. He even got a laminated badge with the title Emotional Support Officer and a paw print doodled in the corner. Outside the medical equipment and formalities, something beautiful was blooming. Connection. Between a recovering infant and a dog with a quiet soul. Between tired parents learning to smile again. Between caregivers and moments of shared warmth that helped everyone breathe just a little easier. Emily and Josh finally decided on their son's full name, Leo Bennett Walker. Leo, short for Leonard, wasn't random. Emily explained it to a nurse one day as she ran her fingers over Leo's tiny hand. "It means lion-hearted," she said softly. "We weren't sure about it at first, but after everything he's fought through, it just fits." She paused, then added, "Diesel gave him that strength. He gave us that strength." The name spread quickly through the NICU. Soon, even the hospital chaplain who came by once a week referred to him as our little lion. Diesel remained ever faithful. On days when Leo needed extra tests or treatments, Diesel paced the hallway until he returned. On long, anxious nights, he'd lie beside Josh's feet without moving for hours. If Emily cried, Diesel would place his head gently in her lap, tail still. One day, a nurse caught a photo of Leo reaching toward Diesel through the incubator's open hatch. The baby's fingers barely brushed the soft edge of Diesel's ear, but it was enough. That image would go on to hang in the NICU hallway, a symbol of resilience, loyalty, and the strange, powerful ways that love shows up. As the days passed and Leo grew stronger, the tension that once lived in every breath began to loosen. He opened his eyes more often. He responded to voices. He even made a soft sound once that the nurses swore was the beginning of a laugh. Diesel wagged his tail, not wildly, not in excitement, but gently, like a promise. The bond between Leo and Diesel had become more than therapy, more than comfort. It was friendship in its purest form. A quiet understanding between two souls, one just beginning life, the other carrying its scars, and the space they had made for each other. Healing, it seemed, didn't always come in medicine or machines. Sometimes it came in fur and breath, and the simple act of being seen. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the hospital halls were already busy. Nurses moved quietly with clipboards in hand. The overnight staff nodded their goodbyes, and the first soft rays of morning crept into the windows of the NICU. Inside the room where Leo had spent his first fragile months, the air was different now, lighter, expectant. Leo was going home. He was still small, his limbs still delicate, but his eyes were bright and curious. The tubes were gone. The beeping monitors were silent. For the first time since he entered the world, Leo had nothing attached to him but the warmth of a knitted blue blanket and the gentle hum of life. Emily stood beside his crib, adjusting his hat. Her fingers trembled, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming flood of relief. Josh stood behind her, holding the car seat, smiling softly. Behind them, Diesel sat near the doorway, wearing something new around his neck. A small laminated badge hung from his collar. It read in neat handwriting, Dr. Diesel, NICU Guardian. There was a paw print in the corner, drawn by one of the nurses. Someone had even taped a tiny bandage sticker over the edge for good measure. The staff had gathered for a quiet farewell. A few nurses took turns giving Leo one last gentle touch on the hand. One of them knelt down to rub Diesel behind the ears. "You did good, buddy," she whispered. "You kept your promise." Everything should have been perfect, and yet something hung in the air. As the family prepared to leave, Diesel didn't move toward the door. He didn't jump with excitement or wag his tail. He stood still. Then slowly he walked away from the group, his steps steady but strangely heavy, and made his way down the hallway, turning left at the junction instead of right. Emily frowned. "Diesel?" Josh followed after him. They found him sitting beside a long window at the far end of the hallway, the one that overlooked the back parking lot, where ambulances sometimes came and went. Rain was falling now, gentle and constant, drumming against the glass like a memory. Diesel was staring out, his posture calm but unmoving. He didn't turn when they approached. Emily crouched down beside him, laid a hand on his back, and whispered, "We're going home now, Diesel. We did it. Leo's okay." Still, he didn't move. Josh knelt beside them, and for a long moment, all three just sat there, silent, watching the rain blur the streetlights outside. And in that silence, Josh suddenly understood. Diesel wasn't waiting for Leo. Not anymore. He had already known Leo would be okay. From the day he first lay beneath the incubator, something inside Diesel had shifted. But it hadn't been about Leo alone. Diesel had returned to this hospital not just to help, but to heal. Josh remembered what the shelter volunteer had told them all those weeks ago, that Diesel had once belonged to an older couple. That he had waited under the crib of a baby who never came home. That after the boy died, Diesel stopped eating, stopped playing, stopped barking. That pain, the kind only witnessed love can hold, had never left him. Until now. Until Leo. Emily, brushing a tear from her cheek, whispered, "He needed to finish something, didn't he?" Josh nodded. He couldn't save the first one. But this time, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The rest of the day moved in slow, meaningful steps. The discharge papers were signed, Leo was carefully strapped into his seat, and Diesel, after some coaxing, followed them to the car. He sat beside Leo, just as he always had, leaning slightly toward the baby, head lowered, with a quiet grace. That night, back at home, Leo slept in a bassinet beside their bed. Emily and Josh lay together for the first time in months, without fear buzzing in their chests. Diesel curled up at the foot of the crib, eyes half closed, but his body alert as ever. But the next morning, Diesel was gone. Emily found the front door slightly ajar. Panic rose in her throat, but there were no signs of struggle, just wet paw prints leading down the front path and out toward the street. Josh grabbed his coat and followed the trail, his breath catching. It led back to the hospital. Diesel was there, sitting once again by the same window, staring out through the glass at the now cleared sky. The rain had stopped. The first soft light of morning lit up the clouds in shades of gold and rose. Birds chirped somewhere beyond the building. Josh walked over slowly and sat beside him. "Hey, boy," he said, voice low. "You came back." Diesel didn't turn his head, but his eyes were calm, as if something inside had finally settled. Emily joined them minutes later, carrying Leo. She knelt and placed the baby gently in her lap, letting Diesel smell him, feel his warmth. Diesel looked at the child he had guarded, the life he had watched grow stronger day by day, and blinked slowly. It was enough. Josh noticed it then, the way Diesel's breathing had slowed, the way his body had relaxed not in sleep, but in release. The pain that had once rooted itself deep within him, the loss, the confusion, the unresolved grief, was no longer there. He had returned to the place of his greatest sorrow, not to grieve again, but to make peace, to watch another baby make it out. To see a sunrise, not marked by loss, but by light. And in doing so, Diesel had completed something only he understood. Leo grew up with Diesel by his side. From the moment he took his first steps on the living room rug, to the day he climbed his first tree in the backyard, Diesel was never more than a few feet away. Where Leo went, Diesel followed, slow, steady, and patient as ever. They were an unusual pair, a boy and his dog connected by a bond that began long before Leo could remember. But even without memory, the connection lived inside him. Diesel had guarded him through those early fragile days, and somehow Leo seemed to understand that. At bedtime, Leo would curl up with his head resting on Diesel's flank, the rise and fall of the dog's breathing, lulling him to sleep. Diesel never left until the boy's breathing matched his own. It was as if the rhythm they'd shared through the incubator glass had never really stopped. Over the years, they became inseparable. Diesel never learned many tricks, and Leo never cared. He didn't need a dog who could fetch or roll over. He had one who understood silence, who stood watch without question, who waited at the school gate each afternoon, like it was the most important job in the world. But time is not something even the most loyal friend can outrun. By the time Leo turned 7, Diesel's muzzle had grayed completely. His legs stiffened with each season. He took longer naps and climbed stairs more slowly. Leo, now old enough to notice these changes, began to walk a little slower too, never in a rush to leave Diesel behind. On the day Diesel passed, the sky was soft and overcast. There was no storm, no sudden tragedy, just a quiet ending that felt more like a closing chapter than a loss. Diesel lay on the porch in his favorite spot, head resting on a blanket Emily had once used to swaddle Leo. Leo sat beside him for hours, talking softly, telling him stories the same way Emily once had on the NICU floor. He told him about his school projects, his favorite books, how he was trying to learn the guitar like Dad. Diesel didn't respond, but his ears twitched once or twice, and his eyes stayed on Leo's face until the very end. He passed peacefully, his head on the boy's lap. Leo didn't cry right away. He didn't scream or ask why. Instead, he stood up, went into the kitchen, and began to write. He wrote a letter. It took him nearly an hour. He didn't ask for help with spelling. He didn't show it to anyone. When he finished, he folded it carefully and tucked it into an envelope. The next day, dressed in his school clothes and holding Josh's hand, he walked into the hospital he hadn't seen since he was a baby. He asked the receptionist to speak to the NICU director. She came, puzzled by the request, and Leo handed her the envelope. Inside was a single-page letter, written in pencil, in the careful handwriting of a determined 8-year-old. It read, "My name is Leo. I was born here when I was very small and very sick. My dog, Diesel, helped save me. He stayed with me when I couldn't breathe. He made me feel safe. I don't remember it, but my mom and dad told me the whole story. Diesel passed away yesterday. I would like to ask you to put this letter up in the NICU so other babies can know that someone is always watching over them. Some angels don't have wings. Mine had 4 legs and a soft heart." The letter was framed and hung on the NICU wall later that week. Since then, countless parents have stood in front of it, hands wrapped around coffee cups, tears welling in their eyes. Nurses still pointed out to families during difficult days. Doctors who were there during Leo's time smile quietly whenever they pass it. It's just a letter, a small thing on paper. But for those who read it, it means more than that. It reminds them that sometimes healing doesn't come from medicine alone. Sometimes it comes from something simple and pure, like the companionship of a dog who never gave up. And Diesel's story lives on in that hallway, quiet, unassuming, eternal. If you've made it here, thank you. You've just witnessed a quiet miracle, a dog who waited, a baby who fought, and a bond that never asked for anything in return. At Veil Marks, we believe stories like these remind us that love, in its purest form, is silent, steady, and fiercely loyal. The greatness of a nation can be judged by the way its animals are treated. Mahatma Gandhi. Please, if this story stirred something in you, leave a comment. Tell us how it made you feel. And don't forget to subscribe. Reaching 1,000 subscribers means we can continue crafting stories that heal, inspire, and stay with you long after the screen fades to black. This was more than a video. It was a lesson in love.